Sometimes a good gimmick can be the difference between a talented wrestler getting lost in the mid-card shuffle and them main eventing WrestleMania. After all, before he became Stone Cold, Steve Austin was wallowing away as the Ringmaster, and prior to him finding fame as the Hitman, Bret Hart was almost saddled with being a cowboy. That said, sometimes, even when the right character falls into a person's lap, it can be taken away again before they get a chance to see it reach its full potential, leaving us to all wonder what could have been if things had gone differently. But what are the best examples of this? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. So join us as we take a deep dive into Almost Had It, Great Gimmicks That Were Dropped Too Soon. Of course, if we're starting anywhere, where better to start than with someone who, while in NXT, was already being talked about as the female equivalent of John Cena. And that's because when Bayley was playing the hugger there during the mid-2010s, she was arguably the most over woman on the entire roster. How did she do this? Well, by just playing up to her real-life persona of being an incredibly fun-loving young woman who had grown up being a super fan of wrestling. And with this fandom shining through then, it quickly got her over with the live audiences at Full Sail University, particularly the young girls. Yes, at one point, the Bay Area girl even had her own dedicated superfan in the form of Izzy. So noticing this, Triple H would push Bayley to the moon, as by 2015, she'd have dethroned Sasha Banks in an instant classic to become the new NXT Women's Champion. From there, it only seemed like a matter of time until she was called up to the main roster and Vince McMahon could get a chance to make some serious money with her. Unfortunately, though, this was late period McMahon we're talking about, and so instead of recognizing the cash-printing mega babyface he had on his hands when the hugger joined Raw the following year, he botched the whole thing by taking her in a far more cartoonish direction instead. And the way he did this was to have Bayley morph from being a fun-loving fangirl into a literal child, as over the course of the next few months, the fan favorite would become so infantilized she was even afraid to use a weapon during a weapons match. Needless to say, this saw her main roster run crash and burn as those fans who had once been so strongly behind her started to turn on her in droves. In fact, despite her initially having all the potential in the world as a babyface hero and role model to young girls everywhere, it wasn't until she turned heel in 2019 that Bayley was really able to start turning things around, as it was then she was able to find a new wrinkle to her gimmick. Had things been done correctly in the first place, though, she wouldn't have had to do this, and maybe instead, we'd be talking about the hugger today as the top star in women's wrestling like she deserves. And she's not the only woman in WWE who had a promising gimmick pulled out from under her either. Though in the case of Lacey Evans, her sassy Southern Belle character was meant to get her over as a heel. But why wouldn't it? After all, with her constantly using her time on the mic to lambaste the fans in attendance who she saw as being beneath her, Evans would find it easy to get booed whenever she was on NXT television during the late 2010s. And when she was called up to the main roster in 2019, it seemed like the boss was all in on the idea too, because he quickly started pushing the former US Marine to the moon by having her enter into a program with then undisputed women's champion Becky Lynch. Unfortunately, though, as time went on, things would begin to stagnate, and so Evans would find herself rarely having anything meaningful to do outside of a short-lived romance angle with Ric Flair. Yes, while she would be a regular fixture on TV during this time period, her angles were way more often than not forgettable, as it usually felt like WWE didn't truly know what to do with her. Could more have been done with her gimmick at this point? Sure, and had it stuck around here, maybe things might have shifted in a positive direction once again. Ultimately, though, this wouldn't be in the cards because in 2021, Lacey would fall pregnant with her second child, leading to her having to take some time off TV as a result. And when she returned the following year, she'd be repackaged, now as a seemingly babyface military hero who, for some reason, was still acting heelish on occasion, making the new character very confusing. Yes, it's probably a run which is best left forgotten now. One run we wish we could remember for having gone on longer, though, would happen only a few years before this, because in 2017, Kevin Owens would have a brief spell as the face of America. But wait, what's this all about? Well, after losing the Universal title to Goldberg at that February's Fastlane pay-per-view, KO would turn on his friend Chris Jericho and make it his goal to take the United States strap away from him. And while he was ultimately able to do this at WrestleMania 33, the French-Canadian would be shipped over to SmackDown during the subsequent draft where, now feeling like he needed to freshen up his character, he'd take the belt he was wearing a little too much to heart. That's right, in true heel fashion, despite being from north of the border, Owens would now see himself as the representative of the entire US. And so that was why he would trim his hair and beard, start wearing a suit, and refer to himself as the new face of America. Sadly though, this gimmick would be dropped so quickly that many people have since forgotten it ever happened, a decision which seemed strange at the time given how talented KO was and how much there was for him to work with here. That said, if you're looking for an explanation as to why it was scrapped so abruptly, Owens has since revealed the reason. Yes, KO has stated that feeling like his gimmick was too close to other similar anti-American gimmicks then, he'd asked to have it changed soon thereafter. Still, we can't help but wonder what might have been had he been allowed to run with this one as, knowing Kevin Owens, he would have done something truly special with it. But he needn't feel too disappointed about the missed opportunity this represented as, years prior, his hero and namesake, Owen Hart, would also have a great gimmick which was dropped before it could reach its full potential too. What was this? Well, it was the period where he was wrestling as the Black Heart. Of course, this one almost never came about at all, as it happened because, following the events of the Montreal Screwjob in November of 1997, Owen seemed pegged to be a huge babyface star, especially as he was the last Hart left on the roster at that point. Unfortunately though, backstage politicking from the Clique would see a big-time main event run be squashed, and so instead, the runt of the Hart litter would have to return to the drawing board. And what he came up with was a welcome substitute in the end because after turning heel and joining the Nation of Domination, Owen would start referring to himself as the Black Heart, someone who had never been fully accepted by the fans and who, as a result, was rejecting them from here on in. So with his entry into the Nation now being explained, Owen would go on an excellent run as he got to feud with Triple H over the European title, all before then setting his sights on Ken Shamrock. After that, though, things would take a shift as, feeling like the Black Heart character had run its course, Vince McMahon would instead shift Owen into more of a lower-card babyface role when he returned him to an old gimmick, the Blue Blazer. And we all know what happened next. Owen would tragically die in May of 1999. Yes, gone at such a young age, Owen had so much more he had left to give as both a wrestler and a man. And on the wrestling side of this coin, there are few people we would have been more excited to see him wrestle during his later years than someone who had a great short-lived run as the gold standard in 2007, and that's Shelton Benjamin. Of course, what made the gold standard gimmick so special was that it allowed Benjamin to play up to what he did best, being one of the best in-ring wrestlers of his generation. And this would be something he would show over the next couple of years which followed, as whether it be on ECW or SmackDown, the South Carolina native could always be counted on to have a killer match with folks like CM Punk, Kofi Kingston, or Sheamus. Sadly though, despite going full in and dyeing his hair blonde for the role, it would be deemed to have run its course by 2009, as then Benjamin would be returned to the tag team division when he re-teamed with Charlie Haas. But we still can't help but feel like there's more which could have been done with this gimmick. Who knows? Maybe with enough time, he could have even been a world title contender. And that's not the only mid-card gimmick of this era which could have gone on to the main event if used properly, because only a couple of years after the gold standard died out, undashing Cody Rhodes would rise to the forefront. That said, this one originally started out very differently because the year prior in 2010, after having been voted the most attractive male wrestler by an informal poll carried out on the roster backstage, the grandson of a plumber would begin coming down to the ring as dashing Cody Rhodes. Needless to say then, this would see him portray a vain and arrogant heel, someone who wished to protect his looks above all else. That would change, however, when, during a match with Rey Mysterio in January of 2011, a botched 619 would see Cody legitimately break his nose. And because of this, he would come out to the ring the next week with a protective mask on, seemingly having now lost his mind and referring to himself only as undashing Cody Rhodes. Following this, so over did this Jekyll and Hyde gimmick get that, even after his nose had healed, Cody would continue to wear the mask, with him also taking to handing out paper bags to audience members during his promos so that they could cover their faces from him. And it was all made that much better by the fact that, with his mask being clear plastic, everyone could see that he looked the same as he always had, and that his proclamations that he was now a monster were obviously ridiculous. That said, for as much juice as this one still had left in it, especially after he'd proven himself in the ring during feuds with Sin Cara and Daniel Bryan, once WWE decided to turn Cody babyface again in August of that year after he won the Intercontinental title, there was simply no room for the undashing character anymore. And so that was why it would have to be dropped abruptly here, never to return to this day. But then who knows? With Cody back in WWE now, following a spell over in AEW, there's always the outside chance he'll revive it one day. One thing we can be sure of is that no matter what happens, we'll never see nails in a Vince McMahon-owned ring again. How can we be so sure of this? Well, despite being one of the more memorable gimmicks of the late Golden Era, Kevin Washolz would completely burn his bridges with New York when he assaulted Vince in his locker room following a pay dispute the two had in 1992. Prior to that, however, he'd been set to get a top heel role in the company as, after making his debut earlier in the year, he'd established himself as the archenemy to the Big Boss Man. And the way he did this was by portraying himself as an ex-convict who had been the victim of police brutality from Ray Traylor while behind bars. This then would lead to him taking out all his anger on not only the Big Boss Man, but also the WWF fans too, as over the weeks and months which followed, he'd repeatedly attack his enemy and leave him laying. So that would ultimately necessitate things being settled once and for all in a nightstick on a pole match at that November's Survivor Series, with this one seeing the fan favorite come out on top. Not that the loss was the end for Nails, however, because from there, he was supposed to get into a program with The Undertaker. Unfortunately, though, any potential there was in this would have to be scrapped when he was fired soon thereafter and was banned from all subsequent WWF events as a result. And he's not the only person who would find himself out of a job following the aborted run of what had initially been a promising gimmick. Though in the case of Billie Kay, it wasn't because she'd gotten violent behind the scenes. No, for her, despite teasing a babyface turn when she started a resume gimmick in late 2020, she'd end up being the victim of the dreaded budget cuts. Yes, sadly, in 2021, Billie would be released from her contract. And this was an even bigger blow for her at this point because prior to that, it looked as if she was finally hitting her stride as a singles performer after splitting from her teammate and real-life best friend, Peyton Royce, in the months before. Of course, the way she had done this was to play up to her strengths, with these being both her skills on the mic and her comedy chops. And that was what led to her starting to approach other wrestlers backstage then as she sought entry into their inner circles. How would she do this? Well, quite brilliantly. By handing out resumes as if she were a teenager wandering around department stores looking for a job in the early 2000s. But despite her finding no luck with this initially, eventually her persistence would pay off when she managed to become a member of the Riot Squad on a probationary basis. And why was it probationary? Well, the group's members, Ruby Riott and Liv Morgan, never fully trusted the new recruit, a feeling which proved to be justified when Kay ended up taking a job elsewhere after joining forces with Carmella in the lead-up to WrestleMania 37. That said, this would also mark the final hurrah for the Australian in WWE because, soon thereafter, she'd find herself having to hand out resumes to other wrestling companies instead, as she looked for a job with them. Still, at least she did get to reunite with Peyton Royce at this point, so it's not all bad. After all, the same couldn't be said for another promising tag team which was split up a few years prior, because when Simon Gotch was released from WWE, it wouldn't only split up the Vaudevillains, but it would leave him having to return to the Indies without his tag partner Aiden English. And that's a tragedy in many ways because the two really could have been so much more together had they been given the chance. Yes, as the throwback to end all throwbacks, Gotch and English's gimmicks of two old-timey strongmen harkened all the way back to the days when wrestling was still a part of the carnival circuit. But while this did somewhat clash with the more realism-focused era of the mid-2010s, the duo were able to make it work completely by committing to it fully. So, over the course of their 3-year run on NXT then, they'd find success serving as regular foils to the likes of Enzo and Big Cash, or Blake and Murphy, having entertaining showings each time they came through the curtain. Then, when they moved over to the main roster in 2016, things seemed to be going well initially, as now on the SmackDown brand, the Vaudevillains would get to mix it up with teams such as the Lucha Dragons and the New Day. But despite the gimmicks seeming to have a very definite shelf life, there were many who felt a lot could still be wrung from it when Vince McMahon decided to split them up 1 year later. That said, the decision to separate the duo could hardly be avoided at this point, because it would be here when Simon Gotch would be fired after backstage issues. One superstar that's seemingly beloved behind the scenes, however, is our next entry on the list, and in 2011, there was so much more which could have been done with R-Truth as a heel. Sure, you could argue that the North Carolinian has always been a better babyface on account of his incredibly likable personality and his excellent comic timing. After all, these two aspects of his personality are probably the main reasons why he's remained in WWE for so long, longer than almost any of his peers in fact. That said, for as entertaining as he's always been playing the bumbling and goofy babyface, there was a moment at the beginning of the 2010s where he got to add a lot more depth to his character and, in the process, briefly reached the main event level. It all started when, after becoming #1 contender to John Cena's WWE title in April of 2011, R-Truth would decide he had to get serious if he wanted to stand a chance of winning the top prize. So in order to get more serious then, he'd turn heel on the champ a week later, with him from there putting on a decent showing with Big Match John at that summer's Capital Punishment pay-per-view, even if he didn't get to win the big one. And perhaps it was this loss which made Truth realize that, even if he was a heel now, he should still be keeping some of his trademark comedy elements. So doing just this then, he'd introduce audiences to Little Jimmy soon thereafter, an invisible child who he basically took on as his mascot for a time. But that wasn't to say he couldn't still get serious, because later that year, he'd have returned to the main event picture when he teamed with The Miz and caused a huge scene by invading the titular cage match at October 2nd's Hell in a Cell. In fact, such a scene did he cause here that, the following month at Survivor Series, he'd get to take part in The Rock's first match in almost a decade when he and The Miz took on Rocky and John Cena in a tag team bout. Following this, though, the decision would be made to turn Truth babyface once more when The Miz attacked him and left him for dead. And while it was nice to see him on the side of the good guys once more, there was still a sense that something was being left on the table by not continuing on with his heel run for a little while longer. Of course, when it comes to our next entry today, his short-lived but promising gimmick had nothing to do with him being a heel or babyface. No, instead, in the case of Tyson Kidd, we just wish we'd gotten to see more of his run of having different managers every week in 2011. Yes, it might seem like a weird character quirk to try and get over, but back at the turn of the 2000s, Kidd would be able to make something of an early splash when he'd start appearing on Superstars with different people by his side every week. And the reason for this, at least in kayfabe, was that he was never happy with the person he'd hired, and so was always looking for someone new who might be able to do the job correctly. That was why, after Michael Hayes failed to impress him on the May 12th episode of Superstars, the Hart family graduate would kick the former Freebird to the curb. Unfortunately, though, the next attempt at a manager, Armando Estrada, would not fare any better, and so after only one night, he'd also be given his marching orders, with him never to stand by the Canadian's side again. And his third advisor, Matt Stryker, would serve an equally short spell in the role too, as despite him helping Kidd to defeat current AEW star Trent Beretta on June 2nd, the Canadians still felt unhappy with how they were gelling. So maybe his fourth attempt would work then. At least that was what he hoped when he brought out Vicky Guerrero to the ring with him the following week. Sadly, however, this would also prove to be short-lived, as would his fifth and final manager on the episode of Superstars after that, JTG. At the very least, though, even if he wasn't able to find the right person for the task, the whole thing was Kidd got over and gave him a storyline to sink his teeth into. It's just a shame then that things would be cut off here and the whole angle would be dropped, with the reason for this probably being that he was running out of managers to audition. Still, if a few more could have been brought in, maybe even some classic names from the past such as The Genius or Mr. Fuji, there was something which could have been expanded upon here. In the end, though, like everything else we've discussed today, it'll have to go down in history as an example of a missed opportunity, because if only a little more time had been given to any of these entries, who knows how different their careers might have been.